So Jane worked as the senior vice president of the Internet Society's Internet Growth Project teams. The Internet Growth Project teams are focused on community networks, internet exchange points, interconnection peering, and community development. And they recently had a new critical project on measuring the health of the internet. Her work also focused on access and development strategy, where she and other ISOC colleagues and partners focused on coordination of collaborative strategies for expanding internet infrastructure access and related capacities in emerging economies with partners. So without further ado, I would like to welcome here today with us, Jane Coffin.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and thank you everyone who's helped set this webinar up. I know there's a lot of work that goes into putting something like this together. I'm going to warn you that there's a very curious cat here at my mother's house. So if you see a cat jumping around on the table here, I will remove the cat, but it's a very lovely cat. But just to know that we may have a little bit of interruption. Thank you very much. And I would like to make a disclaimer. I recently left the Internet Society in a happy way to take on take a pause and to take on some new opportunities. But I would just say that I was the senior vice president of Internet Growth, and I was really proud of the progress and my own personal development growth as an executive, moving up the roles at the Internet Society. I don't want to say seniority or anything like that, because sometimes you have people of all cultures and ages, and ageism is something I want to be very careful of, because it's not how old you are, it's your experience and your abilities that take you into different roles and places. But as a senior vice president there, I will say that I've been at the Internet Society for 9.75 years. I say it that way because it was almost 10. And I think it's the longest time I've been in a job. I was in the US government in different roles for about 8 years at 2 different times at AT&T, and then I was also in the field. So I've had a long career both in the government, in the private sector, and now in the nonprofit sector. And it's been really super to have that type of experience. And I will say, for those of you that are familiar with international organizations, I worked very closely throughout my career in the last, I can't believe it's over 20 years, at the in various ways with, I shouldn't say at, the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. So I've had a lot of experience with UN organizations, and that really helped set my career off when I was a young person working in the US government. I worked in the development sector as a rapporteur on connectivity issues for universal service and universal access. And I got to know a lot of people that way. I networked. And so one of the first things I would say to all of you is networking is one of the most important things. And I don't mean it can be a very subtle way of networking. It's just getting to know people. I guess I am very lucky that I grew up in an environment where my parents taught my brother and me to be curious and to be very interested in other cultures. When I was, I think, 5 or 6, a young man from Indonesia came to stay with us for a couple of days. He was an American field service student, which meant he was an exchange student in the United States. And we were fascinated by his culture and what all the things he told us and his different languages. So I was very lucky at an early age to have that put into my basic, the way I looked at the world was from a very, very different lens. I'm sitting in Maine right now, which some people would think is very from New England. It's the most northeastern state in the United States. Some people would think, oh gosh, you're from Maine. It's very, there aren't a lot of people here, by the way. There are more trees than people. But they might think that because you're from an American state in the Northeast that you might not know much about other cultures. Well, it takes curiosity, and it takes trying more and more to be out in the world. I was an exchange student when I was 17, 18, and I lived in the country of Sweden. And since that time, I've lived in 3 other countries, and it's been a real pleasure. I'm very interested in other cultures, and I think that helped me with my career, just listening to people and asking a lot of questions. Or maybe I asked a lot too many questions on occasion, just because I'm fascinated by other cultures and how the world works. And I think that helped me a great deal when I was in my various jobs. And it's been very good for me to have had the role in government both policy and regulatory more when I was working in the field, not with the government. And by field, I mean, I was living overseas for 5 years in Moldova for 2 years and Armenia for 3, working closely with the government officials and the local stakeholders. We didn't call it multi-stakeholder at that time, but it certainly is multi-stakeholder. And it's very important that you're working with people across all sectors when you're trying to make decisions that will impact the growth of internet connectivity or telco connectivity at that time. So what was it like to be a senior vice president at the Internet Society? I think it basically, I should start with what was it like to work at the Internet Society? It's such a great organization. People from all over the world work there. And that was one of the key things for me, in addition to obviously wanting to build a bigger, better internet. For me, internet connectivity kept me as a lifeline when I was overseas. It's obviously helped many of you during the pandemic, and people all over the world stay in touch. I'm a true believer in connectivity, but also a believer that people need to have it, of course. And so I've lived in places where I didn't have great connectivity, and I know what it's like to only work from your Yahoo Mail. that was my life when I was overseas. We didn't have official project mails that worked in country well. I'm very familiar with having to work with something called very small aperture terminal connectivity, VSATs. Most of the embassies around the world use VSATs. So it's very interesting to have lived in different places where connectivity wasn't great, and then coming to work for an organization like the Internet Society that wanted to, still wants to, make sure that there's great connectivity around the world and that people have access to it and that it's more secure and strong. I will talk about internet growth now. The portfolio that a colleague named Michuki Mwangi will take over is related to that infrastructure growth and measuring the health of the internet itself. There were 3 projects at that time, and there are more now because they've divided up some of the work. But back then, when I was managing the projects, it was community networks and where you deploy them, how you train people, how you develop policy and regulation, and capacity building. The other second project of the 3 was internet exchange points. I've had the extreme pleasure of being in the Philippines, in Manila, working closely with the ISOC chapter, working with the ministry and the regulatory body at the time. I think Ashi and Bani were 2 people I remember so well. Of course, Dennis, who's now got a different role. But we've helped there with the PHNOG, the network operator group, getting that started. Really, it was everyone there in the local community. And the internet exchange point was the team, really, Bunny and Achi and others. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Noelle de Guzman, who's there in Manila, who's with the Internet Society. She's a wonderful human being, but she's also done so much for connectivity and development in your region, but also really was key to making sure that when I came to Manila, we were meeting with the right people and trying to promote more connectivity and interconnection. So internet exchange points and community building were the second project. And with internet exchange points, the key issue there also is interconnection, promoting more equal, sort of neutral interconnection around the world, which will help people have cheaper, better, faster internet in their countries. And a lot of the work, both from the community network side and the internet exchange point side, is building community, local community. Every country and different parts of every country are different. You have to listen to local people, train local people at that local level for sustainability. You cannot just assume, in my opinion. I never liked, well, let me tell you what the story is here. I watched people come into countries when I was working overseas and pretend that they knew everything about the country. They thought they could tell the local people how it was, how they should be, and what they should think. And that worried me because that's not sustainable. And I learned very quickly that that was not my style, obviously. And it even wasn't my style when I was in the US government. While the US government when I was in the government had their views, it's certainly not the view of people in a certain country. That's just silly. So what was important for me was to think about how you would apply good practices or best practices, it depends on what you call them, in different parts of the world. And so it's not more about we know better, it's more here are some things that could be useful for you to adopt or adapt. Adaptation is really critical, particularly how would I know what it's like to be in an island nation, although I have lived on islands. when you are in an island nation, and an island nation that has over 8,000 islands like you do, here's an interesting fact for you. The state that I'm in right now in the United States has 4,300 something islands. Who knew? I didn't. A man on a plane told me last Sunday how many islands we have here in Maine. So I do have a deep appreciation for how hard it can be to connect those islands, whether you need to look at submarine cables or LEO systems or satellite. It's expensive. And so I have an appreciation for that. But back to the point, you've got to take a look at what it's like in your local circumstances. Whether you're on an island or you're in the high Arctic, we've been 200 miles above the Arctic Circle when I was at ISOC, working with tribal communities or indigenous communities in Canada. And in the United States, we have Alaska. There's lots of differences between how you can actually get connectivity into a country. You can't put fiber under the ground in an Arctic region because there's something called permafrost. It will break the fiber pretty fast. In your country, and in the region that you're in, you've got to think about submarine cables and different connectivity and the heat factor and humidity. Humidity is not necessarily your friend when you're talking about equipment. So there's got to be different ways that you look at how to deploy equipment. And training, we all come from different cultures. We all have different philosophies in government about how to bring more connectivity to a country. So it's really important to listen. And that was one of the things I think from the time I started at ISOC that I brought and I hope I always was respectful culturally of other people. You make mistakes, of course, but you try to be very respectful. But listening has always been critical, but also curiosity, just going to other places and not to travel for traveling. Some people say, gosh, you go everywhere. I'm like, I'm interested in going everywhere. I'm interested in what the differences are, because if you don't know the differences, you can be dangerous as an expert or someone who can help. And when I say expert, it means I may know a lot, but of course, you know more than I do about the local situation. You may know more about a certain type of connectivity that we could have brought in. But the really great thing about the Internet Society team, I can speak from experience here, is that there's a group of really respectful people who are very curious about how they can help. And many of them have either worked for government, done policy, have been trainers at one of the regional internet registries. There are quite a few staff at ISOC. They also have great folks who've been in regional governments in the region, but also have built community networks, IXPs. I've done training all over the planet for both of those issues. And on the measuring the internet side, which is the third project, they have a great Pulse platform, PULSE. I'll send Isabel the link there. There was a really good team of experts from all over the world, from Palestine, Scotland, the US, a woman living in Portugal who's from South Africa now. Lots of different staff who've come together to try and find ways to talk about the importance of data visualization, data for resiliency, studies. There's a great study that just came out on Africa about the African resilient internet, working with Afrinic. So the Internet Society, I think one of the most important things about my time there also was building partnerships. You never want to be the single point of failure as a partner. I've said that many times. I want to say it here. That means that you're always looking for ways to collaborate. You're looking for ways for you not to be the most important anchor in a country. You want to make sure, as a partner, you want to make sure you're bringing in more partners. There's a diversity of views, diversity of information coming in, but also you've got someone that will take over, because your role isn't to run a thing in a country. Your role is to help with local sustainability. And that means training at the local level. We also often would say local training. And that means working to train local people for sustainability. The worst thing I think I've seen when I was in different roles, not when I was at ISOC, but in the field, working full time in other countries, was when they would bring in experts who would just come in and go, versus train people for the local people to be training each other, as I said, but for that sustainability and that local knowledge. It really can be tricky if you're holding back that information and assuming in a very colonial way. And I'm so afraid of this digital colonialization. I'll put that on the clipboard to talk about later. that I see in some places. And so we really don't want to create bottlenecks with expertise either. We want to have people on the ground who are learning and growing and creating a better dynamic in country, much better than the experts can who aren't from that country. So one key thing about the Internet Society was the ability to work with so many people from around the world and the chapters. I want to put in a big note about how important the ISOC chapters are. And those chapters work with not only the Internet Society community itself, but also with other partners around the world. And let me give you an example of partners. A4AI, the Association for Affordable Internet, the Association for Progressive Communications, APC, great organization. And the reason, and of course, ITUD, the International Telecommunication Union Development Sector, so many, the Digital Empowerment Foundation, local government, everywhere that we've worked, and local experts. It really is something unique to, I call it the human chemical reaction. When you start to feel that energy in a room, it's whether it's I've been in Manila or in Delhi or in Thailand with Dr. Kanchana from Bangkok, who's so fabulous. You start to feel that excitement because you know you can hack something together. The hack could be a human hack. You know, human engineering, we would often say, is 80% of the challenge, or 90. You really have to get the social engineering worked out so that you've got people who are able to advocate or build. Sometimes the technology is right there at your fingertips. You've gotten it into the country. You know how to deploy it. You know how to connect the different networks together through BGP at the IXP or bilateral exchange of traffic. But you really do have to work on that human engineering. And many of you probably know that in your daily lives. You could really go into a room and alienate the room if you aren't thinking about how to best look at the situation and come up with good consensus for a productive way forward. But again, how these projects work at the Internet Society, there were 3 big ones that I mentioned in that portfolio. And I should pause and say on the Internet Pulse project, the Pulse platform, which was part of the Measuring the Internet project, that team of people, this was a new project 2 years ago. So I want to say that it was an incredible effort to get the technical platform together, and the team took their time. They paced themselves. They looked at what was best for deployment of the platform, meaning what you see in the front end is way different than what you're working on in the back end with the developers. They took a lot of care in putting that project together. You'll see great data there about internet shutdowns. The reason the Internet Society would want to focus on that at that time, and I'm sure going forward, is when you shut down the internet, you shut down opportunity, you cut off connectivity for socioeconomic development. And I want to pause when I say social and economic. It's really important to have connectivity. The World Bank will tell you, and other experts in economic institutions, the more connectivity you have, the better GDP you have, gross domestic product, the more economic wherewithal you have, and public-private partnerships, the more connectivity, the better your country will be, and the more opportunity. As many of you know who do this work, you have more jobs, you have more digital inclusion, digital equity, you've got more potential for investment, whether it's local investment in local infrastructure or it's some different outside investment that will come in. That Pulse platform has a lot of good data about internet shutdowns, where they're happening, good practices for keeping the internet on. There's great data there on the deployment of IPv6. It's different because that platform is not something where we're collecting, or the Internet Society is not collecting all the data themselves. They're working with third-party partners. So there's really great, robust data partners there. If you want to learn more about this, the teams can talk to you specifically. And I'll leave you Machuki's name so that you can contact him, so you can touch base with the other projects. But part of the key thing about all of the projects there that I witnessed and noticed and brought to the projects, but also the teams brought, was this curiosity, this inclusion, working with many partners, being able to make mistakes. And this is very hard for some people to rationalize when you're a professional, is that you are going to make mistakes. And please ask questions as I'm speaking. I'm happy to pause, and I'll probably give you a chance to ask more questions about some of the portfolio. But you need to be able to make mistakes. An old colleague at a different organization used to call it breaking glass, and technologists will know what I'm talking about. When you're putting a hack together for a system, or you're hacking policy together and trying to work with different people to put something together, you're going to make mistakes, and that shouldn't be seen as a bad thing. I know in some cultures, at least where I worked in the former Soviet republics, nobody made a mistake, or at least that was sort of the governmental culture at the time, and it changed over time. But the staff that I worked with there were terrified of making a mistake. And I once said to them, you really have to let me know if my hair's on fire, because if my hair is on fire and there's something wrong and you don't tell me, it's going to be worse if we don't deal with it now. If we deal with it now, it'll be better. If we don't deal with it, it'll get much worse later on. So I tried to bring that culture into when I was overseas and with the staff, is that nothing's perfect. You always integrate, and you always improve as you go. So that's a really important thing to be aware of. Obviously, many of you know this, but you've got to be able to make mistakes, and you do need good managers who let you make mistakes. That was, I think, something I helped bring to the teams, is that I was pretty flexible. Some people might have said I was too flexible because I'm willing to take the time and see how things go, and just try and hack it more. We were lucky at the Internet Society had to have a good funding stream from PIR and .org. I think many of you know how that works. There are also grants that came in that we were able to bring in, and the grants really helped us expand the work, bring more connectivity to more people, but also train more people. One thing that was not part of the portfolio per se, but is part of the Internet Society's way of working, is a really good new learning team. Rhonda, there's a woman, Rhonda Zeleny, I'm not going to pronounce her name correctly, but Rhonda, who works in the Internet Society, is the lead on e-learning, and she has created a great new platform. This platform is free right now, and you can take courses online, from network operations to internet exchange points. There'll be soon another project learning course on community networks with the IEEE. That's another great partner. I should have mentioned right away. IEEE has been a super partner mostly out of India and New Jersey. Been working with their experts, but there'll be a new community networks training course. There's a training course on encryption, the internet way of networking, and more. So really take advantage of free training when you can. That's something that the Internet Study is very proud of. And I will continue to promote people taking those courses no matter where I am. But I think also one of the key things for working with the staff was, again, allowing for mistakes, working with the teams in a very productive, neutral manner, where people are people. You're not there to look at hierarchy. And the key thing is to give people as much opportunity, because that's where they're going to grow and innovate. That was something that was really great about the work we did there. So community networks, internet exchange points, this is great, measuring the internet team, looking at different aspects of technology. If you're a government official, or if you're someone working with governments, the data on that Pulse platform is really important. It can help you with better evidence-based policymaking. And again, I have been a policymaker and regulator in a past life. I got much more interested in deploying networks because I was tired of some of the policy discussions. I still love policy, don't get me wrong, but I'm more interested in figuring out how we can bring more connectivity for digital inclusion through policy, better and more open policies, inclusive policy. Many countries have an opportunity right now to do more with policy. Some countries have lock-in. You've really got to figure out ways to change. The old telco network regulations are not going to work in a new internet world the same way. They actually will keep monopoly lock-in or duopoly lock-in in some countries. And I've seen that around the world, and I've also seen that in the United States. You would probably be surprised to know that there are many people who are anti more municipal networks and community networks because it might carve into their market share. That for me is so fascinating, because if their business models are sound, why would they care if there's competition? So there's opposition in many places to change. There's opposition to new policy and regulations coming in. There's opposition to change in spectrum and licensing. These are all things that will help community networks and internet exchange points grow, and will help the team at the Measuring the Internet team do what they do through more data that comes in. As many of you also know, data is, of course, very important for everything you do. People want proof. And this was one thing that both on all of the teams that I worked with, we worked really hard to make sure we had case studies or the information up on the website, blogs from outside parties, blogs from the staff, constantly working with partners for blog and video series. There's some really good videos out right now in the community networks landing page at the Internet Society. Same with the IXP team. And again, of course, the whole Measuring the Internet team's key pulse platform will have the data there. You've got to get the information out so that others will believe you when you say community networks work. They're working in Hawaii, they're working in the Republic of Georgia, they're working in the Philippines, or they're working in India. And Dr. Kanchana's got them rolling around in Thailand or in Kenya, where we know there are robust community networks, and in your region, and Nepal. So the really key thing is the trust has to be built among, I should have said this first, you can't have those really great partnerships without trust, and being a good partner is sharing the space. It's not trying to be, again, the only key partner. Only. I find some people's egos get in the way. And so the important thing that I often found is that you want to make other people look great. You want them to be shiny, or to have the opportunity to speak, or have the opportunity to be on a panel somewhere, or to write the blog. It was very interesting to me that some staff came in and were surprised that they were able to get their own voice out there. And that was really an important thing that we were able to give the staff at the Internet Society, where they're running the show, they're doing the interviews, they're working with Jolly, who's helping live stream this, or they're working with a team like the team putting this webinar together to actually do all the work. You need many hands, I think, as people will say, to do good work. And building trust with your partners and building trust with the staff was critical. To this day, I'm always going to be in touch with some of the people there because they were such good friends and colleagues. So building that trust is really important wherever you are. And data helps you build trust when you're working with policymakers, regulators, senior government officials. They want to see, show me where it's been or how many there are. And so that's a lot of work when you're a small staff and you're trying to put together how many internet exchange points are out there. And luckily there are great partners like EuroIX or APIX in the Asia Pacific region. These are the IX associations, the Internet Exchange Point Associations, who create partnerships and collaboration and communities of interest. So it's the Asia Pacific IX community will come together very soon at the Apricot meeting. I believe it's in February, or it'll be at SANOG, or it could be at PHNOG, where like-minded technologists, policy experts, and others will come together to talk about how to deploy the technology, build the IXP, or build a community network. The network operator groups are very good partners and very important. I would be remiss, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, not to talk about APAN, the Asia Pacific National Research and Engineering Network Group. The NRENs are part of that APAN network, but APAN also does really good work on government role and extension of those NRENs, the National Research and Education Networks, partnerships with private sector, but they also do development projects. And so I've had the pleasure of being at APAN meetings in the past and seeing how important the research and education networks are in the region. It's very important they help with big pipes for scientific research, but also can be used for backhaul for community networks. And so I know that some of you are interested in community networks on this call and the webinar, and jump in if you have any questions. But community networks are really about how you work with, not for, a community. Again, it's not a colonial way of working. It's not digital colonialism. I want to be really clear about that. There's been a lot of talk about digital colonialism at the Internet Governance Forum going on right now. It's an online hybrid format. They're in Poland, but they're also online. You can catch a good community network chat coming up in a couple hours with the Dynamic Coalition for Community Connectivity. It's called the DC3. That's Luca Belli, and who's the main person who's running the DC3, along with a fellow named Nico Ashanis from Argentina. So they're a good example of community coming together to build more expertise, more knowledge exchange, more information exchange, and showing people different models for community networks. There's no one community model that is the same. They're not a cookie cutter approach. One of the oldest community networks is in Spain. It's in an area in Catalonia near Barcelona. It's a great network called Guifi, GUIFI.net. And a lot of the networks that I'm going to mention today are on the ISOC website that I can pop in the chat later, or make sure Isabel has because if you go to the Internet Society, internetsociety.org website, and look for community networks, you will then find lots of the case studies and some of the partners that I'm going to mention. So again, with with community networks and internet exchange points, community networks are really about that local community not having connectivity or not having good, affordable connectivity. Community networks are in urban, rural, and remote areas. They're not just rural and remote. Jolly, who's helping stream this session from the Internet Society side, has worked very closely with a group called New York City Mesh. They're in New York City. They've been named one of the top 9 to 10 ways to connect in New York City by the mayor. They were working during the pandemic to roll out networks on the rooftops in New York City. They've got some amazing photos of what they're doing, but it's not the photos that are the best part. What the best part is the connectivity at the community level with local people across the city, actually putting up the dishes, the receivers and transceivers, helping people connect the routers and get cheaper connectivity for some that wanted a more affordable internet and others who didn't have it. So you had people who had to stay at home during the pandemic with their kids, or they couldn't be at work per se, they had to work from home. The New York City Mesh team helped them connect during the pandemic, and of course are going to help beyond that and before that. But that's a different type of model than you'll find in rural India or in your own country. You've got to look at how signals might degrade with a lot of rain because you have some rainy areas where you are, or how you do a point-to-point connection from an island to an island, and how you can make that signal actually deploy better at a different height, depending on what something's called a Fresnel zone. And that takes some training on the radio frequency side. But that training is available and it's free. So again, community networks are not the same anywhere. One thing that I've learned so much about is how to work with, or how to be better at working with Indigenous communities. I'm not the world's expert on that, but a colleague at the Internet Society, Mark Buell, really knows a lot more than I do. And some of the chapter people from the DC chapter have also helped set up community networks or worked with Indigenous experts in the US and Canada. During the pandemic, they had what was called a boot camp for community networks out in California. There are many Indigenous tribes out in California. There's a fellow named Matt Rantanen who runs the SCTV, Southern California Tribal Community Network. I don't know the acronym right off the top of my head, but Matt works with 19 tribes in in California, and he's doing lots of work to also work with Canadian tribes. And this is one of the great things about working with Indigenous communities, is really taking a step back and realizing how little you understand about their culture. And the most important thing is to let them lead you into a better way of working and providing information so that they can find a way in a sovereign manner, because they are sovereign entities, to find what works best in their community. When you work in Indigenous communities, you'll often find that there are sacred tribal areas where you cannot build towers, or you might have to have a ceremony to allow the local ancestors to give you permission to build in a certain area. That I found culturally fascinating. If you're in an Inuit community, there's a different set of different cultural norms that you've got to work with. So connectivity takes some time, particularly when you're trying to be as respectful as you can to build that connectivity, but also at the tribal level and in different cultures, you're going to have different languages that need to be taken into consideration. You want to make sure there's some equity there. You've got to look at the ways of learning and culturally, whether or not cultures want certain content coming in. I know in some tribal areas in the hill country in India, they decided not to have certain types of content come in just because they didn't want a cultural collision. And so they've worked over time to figure out what content is best. I'll obviously not advocate for censorship, but there's certain content that people are going to be very sensitive to when it comes to children and elders. And thank you. Jolly put some note there about New York City Mesh in the chat. Again, going back to community networks, I know that there's an interest with many of you. The key thing is building community, bringing in information, sitting with the community. It can take many visits if you're in a tribal community or a specific community run by a type of whether it's matriarchal, patriarchal, or if a chief is in that area, or whatever you call the local governance structure, you may need to come in several times to explain in very different terms what a community network is. I used to say to people, it's not a group hug, but it may be a group decision in a community where the elders and the local officials need to talk about what this is, what connectivity means, bringing in the technology and the equipment itself. So that's something you need to prepare the community for. There's great opportunity in connectivity. So you may decide that you're going to work with the local teachers. Many teachers are strong, and librarians, actually strong advocates for connectivity. So you need to find your local champions. And the local champions need to know the local politics, and they need to know the local governance structures and the local ways of working. You need to know the rules and the regs and the authorizations that you might need to get to bring in equipment. It's very important you work with local people to make sure that you can build, that you can bring in a certain type of equipment with a certain frequency range or a certain energy level. By the way, with community networks, you can use them to help bring in better infrastructure on the energy side, the electrical grid. We've seen the solar panels in use around the world. The most notable example that I remember is the Republic of Georgia. Obviously, they're being deployed in many places in sub-Saharan Africa where there's a lot of sun throughout the year. In your region, I believe the DEF projects and probably some of the work in the islands have, of course, would be using solar power. Wind power is something that some communities use. It depends. With your community networks, you're going to need backhaul, which means an organization to help you take the traffic from where you are to another network. It's always called backhaul, not uphaul, but anyway, it's taking the traffic back somewhere else to connect with the broader internet. It depends on where you are and how that can be worked out. I'll give you an example from an island tribe in the U.S. in Hawaii, in a place called Waimanalo. There is a submarine cable that landed on the island, and it's Hawaii Tel that is the submarine cable operator. When my colleague Mark Buell and others went to Hawaii for a workshop about, something called the Indigenous Connectivity Summit 3 years ago, when they were working with the local tribal communities and with a fellow named Bert Lum. Bert really is sort of this amazing person who knew how to work the different politics from the governance structure as a US state down to the tribal levels. Bert brought in a lot of energy and experts to work with the community in Waimanalo. The community itself was trained for many months on the technical, the policy, the fundraising, the governance. It's a really great structure with the Indigenous Connectivity Summit. It's about a 6-month prep or 3-month prep before they come into country or to where you are and help deploy a network. So the community had talked to Hawaii Tel about getting backhauls. So they really were lucky. They needed to trench the fiber down to the submarine cable. Obviously, the experts from Hawaii Tel working with the local community worked on the interconnection at that submarine cable landing area. But the Wi-Fi network was put together by Internet Society staff, local Internet Society chapter members, and of course, the local community. And other Indigenous experts were there to help them and to work with them right up until now for the last 2 to 3 years on how to improve that network, bring in more people, and more networks are being built in different islands there in Hawaii and in that area in the Waimanalo area. I don't know all the names because I've memorized Waimanalo, but there's some amazing other networks going in, and you can take a look at the Internet Society website or listen in on the video casts. Very important from an accessibility perspective to have both voice, video, and data information for different people, because some people might be visually impaired, others may not have the hearing capacity. Jolly put in the chat, the New York City mesh team doesn't spy on you. This is an important thing, both with internet exchange points and community networks. Some people think networks are just not generally going to be a place where monitoring can take place of people. And so usually with a lot of the community networks, this is definitely not the case. It's a community network built for and with and by the community. And internet exchange points, for those of you that know IXPs, I just want to put this out there. it was a whole different world after Snowden. I remember doing training pre-Snowden and then after Snowden, when people would say to us on the ground, "Isn't the internet exchange place a place to spy?" I said, "No. If you want it to be, you could have it that way, but that's not what an IXP is. It's a technical platform at the layer 2 and the internet infrastructure structure for exchange of traffic. It's a traffic platform, neutral. It exchanges traffic among and between networks, and that's the whole point. Neutral, neutral, neutral is important. And to help with Jolly's point there about the CNs, with IXPs, it's the same thing. You need to be trusted. And as a trusted platform, you're there to help exchange traffic and make sure the traffic's going from point A to point B with the local networks. And it's not meant to be a monitoring infrastructure. You can, of course, make it that way if that's what someone decides is important, but that's not the technical point. And that's really not what the spirit of, I know from most communities when they build IXPs. But back to community networks, the important thing is building your community, finding your champions, bringing in training and capacity development. That is something that many different organizations help do, from the Internet Society to APC and others. The DEF team does a lot of training as well. And you yourselves can be trainers. All you have to do is work with people to become that type of trainer. And it doesn't take a special type of person to put in a community network. It takes people who are curious. You do need some technical expertise. But we've often found that in some areas, it's your local electrician, the local plumbers. A lot of fishermen have a lot of technical skills that you wouldn't first think about. And farmers, of course, people know the land. They know how to work with machines or machinery. In one network called Mamalia in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, they've worked, oh, sorry, no, that's near Johannesburg. But that network has worked very much so with the local experts putting in the network. You didn't have to bring in a fancy team from outside the country or from Johannesburg. It was the local people that put the network, put the towers up. And you can see the pictures of the towers and horses involved, I believe, or mules. There were horses that helped us get the network, or the local team in the Republic of Georgia. I know that Dr. Kanchana has worked with elephants actually to bring in some equipment in Thailand. So you're talking about whatever works in your local area, but you have a lot of local expertise. And somebody had said recently in one of the Indigenous Connectivity Summit moments, it wasn't capacity development that we were coming in to work with people on. It was more local capacity. I'm not sure the word they used. It was something like emergence or discovery, because there is a lot of local expertise. You just may not know exactly how to take that local expertise and transform it. So let's call it skills transformation at the local level, because there are skills. And this is something that some people will tell you, oh, you need to do this, this, and this. It's very expensive. We've helped start up community networks in some places for $20,000 or less, or $40,000 in Georgia. When you need to have some money coming in order to encourage other donors to help you, or people that are looking to work with you on loans. One of the new things we're seeing on financial transformation for community networks and the donor partner relationship is that grants will work for many years in some areas, but there's a dependency there in grants that may not be sustainable, typically not sustainable. And you may want to look at how you're doing your charging models for sustainability and how you can take in loans. Microfinance is very important. It's not just the big millions and billions that will help build a community network. You can look at microfinance models for sustainability. And that takes us into some of the governance of this community network, and IXPs relies on local sustainability, local financing, changing some of the local rules and regs. And we're seeing around the world more innovative financing models, more innovative change in policy and regulation. So in addition to building your community, training your community, when you need to deploy your network, a lot of that deployment depends on the local authorizations or the rules that are needed, that you need to know in order to be able to deploy. In some places, it's going to be very open. You might just have absolutely no problem deploying your network because there aren't a lot of rules in place, because you can use unlicensed spectrum. I'm a big fan of unlicensed spectrum. I'm going to put a pitch in. This is in the 2.45 and 6 gigahertz bands. Recently, Brazil liberalized their entire 6 gigahertz band to unlicensed spectrum to help more diversity of networks coming in, to help with competition, to help with community networks. They've actually put in rules and regs. It's been amazing to see what Brazil has done. Kenya has recently put in a new licensing regime that allowed for community networks. Mexico led the way more than 4 to 5 years ago, maybe 6 or 7 now, with something called social purpose licensing. They also licensed not only the service itself, but the ability for the network to get spectrum. This is a community network in an indigenous area in Mexico called Oaxaca. So they have a license for services, facilities, and spectrum, free and clear, so that there's no interference from incumbent operators or other entrenched operators who are in the market. The great thing about watching the Rhizomatica network, this is the one in Mexico, they got the licensing and the authorization, and there really hasn't been a change in business for the other bigger companies. They weren't going after that market share that the local network, the last mile networks, as they call them. I don't like to call them last mile. I think first mile would be better, but there's an old language that's out there with respect to the connectivity. Last mile usually refers to the last people connected, is my experience. But those local last mile networks, interconnected in many different ways, but governed in many different ways. In Zimbabwe, where there's a new community network that was rolled out by the Internet Society, along with um, the government actually delayed the deployment for a good reason. They wanted to make sure they could get a license for the spectrum and for the network. There's a really good case study on the Internet Society's website, and there's a case study on Waimanalo from an island nation perspective. So if you take a look there. But with the Zimbabwe network, which is called Morambinda, there was an existing team there in a community about 270 kilometers above Harare, the capital. They had a computer center that had connected some schools. But now with the community network, they're able to connect even more schools. UNICEF has come in to do some work through the Giga project that the ITU is also working on to do more deployments so that there's better schooling connectivity for kids and for the community itself. The local hospitals wired up there in the Murrumbinda area. But that was a really great collaboration with Potras, the regulator in Zimbabwe, and the ministry. Shout out to Minister Jasper there, who really were forward thinking. And many countries in your region have some of these forward thinking experts as well in the governments. Papua New Guinea is looking at using universal service funding to help fund community networks. So you too could talk to authorities in the Philippines or wherever you are to try and encourage change in the universal service regulations. They traditionally were a way to help the incumbent telcos build out to the rural, remote, and urban, underserved and unserved. Those words are very important: underserved and unserved. Unserved means no connectivity. Underserved means maybe the connectivity is too expensive. You could bring in another network because that would help with a more affordable network for somebody at a certain income level. It is a known fact that some of the big operators will go after the more wealthy clients first to build up their return on investment for their networks. And I'm a big fan of working with big companies if it's the right thing to do. The big companies should not try and cannibalize the small companies. Hopefully, they should let the small networks live. But if there's a way to cut a deal on backhaul where they could get universal service credit and the small community network would get free backhaul, I'm all for that. But many people are very keen to make sure that the local governance and local empowerment structures are in place for within community networks. So I talked about the importance of community building, training. There's the importance of governance, which I mentioned is working with the government, but your own self-determination of how you're going to govern that network. It's very important you're talking to each other at the local level and everybody understands what the network's for and how they can help and how they can participate, but what the rules of the road are. And then the last is, so there's empowerment and community, there's deployment, there's training, and there's policy and regulatory. They're usually 4 pillars that the Internet Society looks at. I would add digital inclusion as a 5th leg right now, or a 5th pillar: digital inclusion, digital equity, because you may find that the motivator at the local level is just inclusion from an indigenous perspective or a local language inclusion perspective, and making sure they can interface with officials in a different place where they want to have that connectivity and it's self-determination. So from a digital inclusion perspective, Are you making sure that everybody has an opportunity to connect, from kids to the elderly? Often you'll find that elderly are excluded in some, not in your cultures, but in some cultures there might be they're less inclusion, and you want to make sure that your elders are feeling as though they're valuable to society, no matter how old they are. There's a great network in New York City, a Harlem project that looked at working with seniors in a senior center to encourage them to be able to use email, just be familiar with computers, of course, use email and the internet to connect with their families, but also for more learning and more education and just feeling more a part of society. So it's whatever you want that infrastructure to be, but you do want to talk to your local experts and the local people to see what they're interested in. Now, not everybody, when you have a network developed and in place and the connectivity available, is going to jump on that connectivity and using it. So that's part of the digital equity and inclusion, is teaching people how to use the infrastructure and to find new things that you can do, whether it's teachers finding new courses they can teach or new data points that they want their students to learn from. So I've been talking for a long time. If there are any questions. Okay, LTE versus Wi-Fi for CNs. Well, it depends on where you are and what your interests are and what your local environment is like. We've used LTE has been deployed in Argentina, in the high mountains in Patagonia, an open base station, open source LTE network. That's a great network. It's 4G, obviously. The benefit there may be that there's going to be less degradation of signal, maybe. I'm pretty sure. But Wi-Fi networks, it depends on where you are, if you can get the spectrum. Often people are putting up Wi-Fi networks because it's cheaper. The receivers and transceivers cost anywhere from $200 to $300 to put up on a mast. The masts or the towers are pretty cheap. You can deploy a Wi-Fi network very fast if you've got the unlicensed spectrum. And again, with Wi-Fi, this is the standard developed by the IEEE, EEE. If you don't know IEEE, let me know. I can introduce you to some people. That's another thing I loved about ISOC, and I still love about what I'm going to be doing in the future, is you've got to connect people to each other. Don't hold that data to yourself. You've got to broaden your network by broadening other people's networks. It's just like the internet networks are interconnected, or the community networks will interconnect. You have to interconnect your human networks. But back to LTE and Wi-Fi. With Wi-Fi, it's the 2.45 and 6 gigahertz bands usually. That's what I'm aware of as far as from a technical perspective. That standard is open, and open source is so important. Just to say this, and open standards are very important. Different things, but very, very critical. Hopefully in your region, you have the ability to use that spectrum unlicensed, which means you don't go through a bureaucratic process. You can buy the equipment. It's off the shelf, as they say. Ubiquity gear, MikroTik gear. And if you need some radio frequency training, very basic training, we know some people at the International Center for Theoretical Physics, ICTP, who travel around the planet or could do a video con with you like this to train you. And by the way, I'm going to be working with Dr. Kanchana from Thailand and Marco Zanaro from ICTP to set up some salons for training and just tech discussion and how to set up community networks and other networks. Sometimes they're called municipal networks. It doesn't matter what you call them, as long as you're authorized to do what you can do. And please don't let the governments try and stop you by saying that municipal networks or community networks are not allowed. I'm in the United States, where 17 of the United States don't allow, 17 states of the United States don't allow municipal networks. I just think that's ridiculous. But anyway, that's my opinion and the opinion of many. But you've got to have unlicensed spectrum. So back to that, the New York City Mesh project that Jolly put a note about in the chat here, that you can also find great information on their GitHub site, on their website. That's an unlicensed spectrum use, and that's allowed. That has allowed for Wi-Fi to take off in this country. And I'm pretty sure you've got really good Wi-Fi in the Philippines and in the region. So the difference is that you've got to know what type of network you want to deploy. You can do Wi-Fi with backhaul through mobile if you want. It depends on your experts there. Mobile networks are a little bit more expensive to install, but if you did get some funding, you could put them in. It just depends on what you're looking for and what's allowed faster at that local level. Again, Wi-Fi is easy to stand up. An LTE network might take a little bit more wherewithal and training. But there's a local network in Ghana called STEP, STEP, STEP Network. They're on Twitter. we exchange a lot of tweets together. And I was on a panel yesterday where they were pinging me because they've done such great work. They're sort of a they're a commercial or network, community network. And by the way, the networks come in all types and shapes and sizes. So you can have nonprofit, you can have for-profit, you can have a nonprofit and a for-profit working together. That's the network I've seen in the Eastern Cape of South Africa called Zenzeleni, where they had a nonprofit community network that was then funded through a profitable wireless internet service provider. So if you've got clever WISPs in your area, WISPs, who would want to then work with you at the community level to create a nonprofit where they might help subsidize you, that's a really good way to go. But it really is about how you get your startup funding, what kind of network you want to deploy. You want to take a look at their topography. There's an island in Indonesia. I don't know the name of the island that some colleagues, and also there in the Philippines, some colleagues from Washington State University, I believe, Spencer Sevilla and Curtis Hamrell have been in your region working on the 4G deployment, the LTE deployment, 4G, networks that were open source, open base station, open everything. And if I can get you in touch with some of them, if you'd like. Libra router. Okay. This is a good question. All right. There's some here. Let me check. And Jolly's puts a note there. There's a Slack channel with New York City Mesh where you can participate and ask technical questions. And that's part of what I'm trying to set up on a monthly basis through the Gaia group. I should have explained when I mentioned Marco Zanaro and Dr. Conchana. I haven't had any coffee yet, by the way. So I don't mind being up early because I get up early in general. But if I sound a little fuzzy, that may be why, but I chose this time. So this is not Isabel's fault. This is mine. But if you're interested in the technical questions, you can ask in that site, the Slack site, but you also could participate in these monthly events we're going to hold. It's through the Gaia group, which is the Global Access to the Internet for All. I'm a co-chair of that group with a professor from Spain, and then there'll be another professor coming in from Washington State next year or soon. His name is Curtis. He'll be taking over for a fellow named Leandro. It's part of the Internet Research Task Force, which is part of the Internet Engineering Task Force. The IRTF is separate, but it's part of that IETF ecosystem. And it's really a very interesting group of people who are practitioners deploying technologies who can come together to exchange information about the latest LTE technology that Curtis and team and Spencer are deploying, or about how they set up their Wi-Fi network, or it's also about internet exchange points. We bring different people in, but these monthly meetings will be just a group hack where people are talking about what they're doing. Dr. Kanchana came to me and Marco and said, look, I'm working in a small, pretty poor part of Bangkok where there's a lot of corrugated steel. Many of you will have seen this. I had it in the building I worked in Moldova, where you have a steel roof where the steel is kind of wavy. That steel does a bad job of conducting signals. It bounces signals around. And so it's not always great for your network. But Dr. Kanchana has come to me and Marco and said she'd love to get into a group discussion about what people have done in certain countries to help mitigate against dealing with that corrugated steel, which would probably mean she has a mast taking in a signal, which would then deploy down to the ground level and then probably bounce back up to mid-height level to avoid that corrugated steel. Not avoid it, but to not have the frequency interference. So that's something that we're hoping to hack. There are every 4 months, there's a 3 times a year, there's an IRTF full session, and the Gaia will meet as well. And those are open for anyone to attend. And I can help you with how you would get in free to attend that meeting. But stay tuned for these monthly hacks together so that people can talk about what has worked in their region, what has worked in their area, and what might work for you, or how you could adapt it. Adaptation of the technology and the way people do things is really critical. And then there's a village base station project. Is a Libra router ready for prime time? I think so. I know we had to put in some funding, but so of course at APC, they're doing a great job with this. This is the brainchild, this project, the Libra Mesh, the Libra router of Nico Ashanis and many of the people there, and Peter Bloom and some folks also at the Freifunk, which was one of the first community networks in Germany. The technologists have been working on the Libra router to the best of my knowledge, they're deploying them, and we were helping to deploy, or when I was at ISOC, we were helping to deploy some of that. But let me get back to you on this through Isabel to see where they are, because I think what was part of the tricky thing was making sure that they had the mass distribution, the mass production and distribution set and the funding. But they work. I know people who are using them, and Mike Jensen from APC is a good person to talk to about what some of the, whether or not there are any tricks related to the deployment or hacks. Licensing issues, I don't know. It's a good question. It could be, there could be licensing issues in the US. I don't think they're in use in the United States due to the frequency modulation issues. The FCC in the United States regulates some of the frequency modulation, or they did. I will check into that because it's a good question. They're definitely usable in Latin America. And I know some African countries are deploying the Libra router, but we'll check because they may be deploying them in your region. Licensing is tricky when it comes to equipment and homologation and the standards. Customs, in my opinion, very important in every country, but wow, can they slow down deployment of internet infrastructure if they have to test a piece of equipment for 8 years or 5 years or 1 year or 6 months? Now, you want to make sure the equipment doesn't have any electrical interference or spectrum interference, but sometimes customs and homologation testing are used as a way to slow down deployments of things, or just it can be complicated. We've had equipment sit in warehouses for a very long time. So I would say that you really want to learn how to work with your customs and trade officials to keep your internet out of jail and to deploy that equipment. How do these CNs monitor and do billing? Step work on our community network. We use open source applications. There you go. And we develop our apps too. So Stephen, yay. So Stephen's here. Sorry, Stephen. So Stephen can help you with some of what they do. Other networks were coming, other community networks that I know on the billing side, we're looking, and Jolly could help here too with New York City Mesh. I'm not sure on the billing. There's a standard fee that they charge, but if you can't pay a certain amount, you pay what you can. Others will help subsidize that infrastructure. For the billing in South Africa, there was someone who was running the wireless internet service providers. So they were using some commercial practices like you, Stephen. And I'm not sure if it was per minute, which would be more of a telco model, or if it was capped at a certain volume. But that's something that I can take back because those billing models are going to be really important to get out there in case studies. Stephen, we may be coming back to you to see if there's a way. I'll be working in another organization in the future that's a fund that's looking to fund infrastructure and to look at grants and loans. And that might be something really important for that organization, which is called Connect Humanity, to think about getting some case studies out on. And I'll work with them to do that. The Village Base Station Project, New York City Mesh is donation-based. Yeah, there you go. And is a community-owned network, not an ISP. Very important point. There are vouchers in some other communities. I think in Georgia, they were experimenting with the voucher system. But it's what I'll do is see if I can get back to you through some of the experts at ISOC and APC to give you some more information about the billing models. I'd also note that the book, the DC3 puts out a book for every internet governance forum. There's some great case studies there. And APC also put out a great book a couple of years ago on different models for community networks. Billing was not my expertise at the Internet Society, but I will put you in touch with people who can help you there. I know Matt Rantanen in the Southern California Tribal Community Network wasn't billing in the beginning. It was quote free through grants. And then Matt found that the community there found more value in a network they had to pay for. And that, of course, is more sustainable if you have people paying for your infrastructure. And I can ask Matt and get back to you how they bill. You clearly would need some software to help do that. So that means you'd have to have someone running that through the system and making sure that you were getting the money back. So I would assume a lot of this could be done online. Of course, that'd be much easier. With a voucher system, you could also do this online where you would get a certain amount of credit for a certain amount of capacity or time. It just depends on what you're doing in that network. Donation based too, Stephen. Okay. In Indonesia, they have vouchers. And the Digital Empowerment Foundation networks, I'm not sure. Some of it is subsidized by grants, but there may be also a return there with one of the projects that was an energy-based project that was combining energy deployment with community networks. And there was some different ways that they were financing the networks. So this is clearly an important topic to get back to you on. And also I'll try my best when I'm at Connect Humanity. I start there in January to work with ISOC and others to get more data out there, because this is clearly something that will be a sticking point if you're ready to roll out your network. I would say grants can help you get started, and donations, as Stephen's telling you here. Actually, there's some good, Stephen, I'm not sure if Stephen's network is, or his donation is through a GoFundMe campaign, but some folks are using GoFundMe or PayPal and other where you can just donate directly. It's a great idea for a startup. And then the question is how you maintain that further down the road. And grants have come in, I know, from different organizations to, say, New York City Mesh, which has helped them get started and then to sustain. But again, you do want that payment system put in place, because your sustainability will be impacted if you don't continue to bring in more funding. Any other questions out there?
Jane, there are actually some questions, a couple of questions from Bert Mendoza in the Q&A tab. I can read them out for you.
Yeah, do you mind?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So first, he asked, you mentioned that you had the chance to work in the government, private, and nonprofit sector. Which of these sectors do you think made the biggest impact in the growth of the internet over the years?
Depends on the country. In some countries, the government hasn't helped with the development of the networks, where they've continued with duopoly, monopoly, or network shutdowns. If you shut down your networks, I mean, I'm just mystified by why. I understand the politics. I've worked in government, but you are harming your country. This is my soapbox for a minute. Let me get on it. If you shut down a network, you're shutting down economic opportunity. Do you really want to shut down your economy? It just mystifies me. And also opportunity for your people. What politician on the planet really wants to say, I don't care about people. I don't care about them having living in my country. I'm going to shut down your opportunity. Really, that's what they're doing when they shut down the networks. And when you also shut down networks during exams in some countries for students, I'm like, the network isn't your problem. It's your examination system. That's the problem. So don't limit the opportunity of students, for God's sake, and others. But which sector was the most beneficial? I have to say that it does depend, but let me use Georgia as an example. It really was the internet community, the Internet Service Provider Association, the Internet Society chapter, the local champions on the ground who showed the government that it could be done and spectrum could be liberalized, and the government knew them and said, okay, we trust you, we're going to work with you. So it really was civil society that came in, and the technical community, I should say that, of course. So it was the technical community, local people, civil society, who showed the government this was doable and a way to connect. So then the government jumped in. So in equal parts now, and then the third leg is the international donor community. And it's really people just trusting someone to take a chance. It was so silly because the Internet Society gave them $40,000. That was their startup funding. Now the Czech Development Agency, the USAID, the World Bank put money into Georgia, but it was due to those local champions on the ground through the Internet Society community and their local ISP association. And a guy named Usha Saturi. There's another guy named Sandro. There's a lot of Ratis in there as well, who's done a lot of work in Georgia, and many, many, many others. And the government officials have been amazing in Georgia. They gave the network the spectrum. They didn't create a bottleneck on a bureaucracy. I would say Argentina, Mexico, the governments have been great, but it was a civil society and technical community push from the bottom up. Brazil has been it's almost been on an equal level, but I would say in Brazil led the way on the government. Well, gosh, it may have been the local community there too, but then the government really helped amplify the importance of a community network and allow it. In these countries where it's not allowed, it's a real challenge. I would say Papua New Guinea, when it was with the Internet Society staff and the local authorities working together. So it has been a partnership. That's a really interesting question. So thank you for that. There are some governments, I don't know if I've ever seen a government just come out and say, hey, you all can build any type of network you want, because that would be great, right?
That'd be ideal.
Within that'd be ideal and within reason. And that would be amazing. And if you don't allow in more networks, you're really saying you don't want a lot of competition. Same with internet exchange points. IXPs are one of the most neutral and community networks that I've worked with, neutral platforms, community-based, all about connectivity. So that's the question. Is your model about profit, or is it more about connectivity? And then how do you make your connectivity model profitable? And how do you make your profitable model more community-based? It can be done. The challenge is that I should say to you that we've had some major challenges, or I have, not just me, but it was when I was at the Internet Society, and I'm sure it'll continue. There are some big companies who don't want to change. And really, if they took the time to realize that politically, it'd be so much better if they were talking about working with communities and building out networks this way with local self-determination. And just better network connectivity at the local level, they would do better. And I don't understand a company that can't find a business model to provide connectivity to the last mile. We've heard from some large institutions, the GSMA being one of them, and big fans of GSMA, but some of their networks indicate they can't get a return on investment for communities of 5,000 and under. Now, for me, that was a weird statement, because I'm in a community of 5,000 and under, and many of you may live in smaller areas of. I'm in a community of 1,400 right now on the coast of Maine. And so I'm not interior. So I'm lucky. At least they have submarine cables coming in here, or better connectivity potential. But if you're in the interior, think if you're in a landlocked country, or like you're sea locked in some areas, you've got to go through lots of other islands, or lots of submarine cables, or you might have to go through land fiber if you're Kyrgyzstan, where they're working on a community network, by the way, where the government it was forbearance there more so. And in some countries, they don't care. They find it very interesting that there are others out there trying to help build connectivity, and they're willing to support it. But it was a really good question. You made me think a bit about who the most important thing is. But I think you want to make sure that you aren't hampered by government. Many government officials would probably find this very interesting as far as their own success, to say that they were able to connect people, and hopefully they would leave you alone to do it. I am not advocating, I want to be clear, that you randomly go in and use equipment that could interfere with other important services that are in place with government. In the US, it's going to be airports. Very important. The airplanes are landing. You don't want to interfere with spectrum. That's Wi-Fi allocated near airports. So it does depend on your local regulatory environment, but it shouldn't be a detriment to connectivity being deployed. I should put it that way. Other questions, Isabel? I may not have seen.
Yeah, there's another one from Bert. So this one's about IXPs. When you're working with the development and deployment of IXPs in a region or country, when do you say that the IXP is successful? Does ISOC have programs for existing IXPs that are struggling to overcome the quote unquote IXP startup hump, where there is equipment already deployed but without demonstrable value yet for ISPs? For example, too few peers or no CDN participating yet. And what about those IXPs that achieve substantial value but chose not to expand because of non-technical, aka administration or financial issues?
So really, this is a lot of it is governance and startup. So IXPs, like community networks, go through different phases. And with IXPs, it's beginning, intermediate, and advanced levels of development. We call them phases when I was at the Internet Society. And I'm going to put you in touch with Naveed Haq, HAQ, who's one of the key leads on the Internet Society projects for IXPs. I've worked on this as well. But Naveed is going to be more in touch with some of the issues that are more current in the region, but also real time now with you. I was managing the teams more toward the end there. And so I may be a little out of date with some things, but what I do know for sure is that when you're in a startup phase as an internet exchange point, You do have to have the trust of the local community, because if you don't, there are going to be fewer people who want to interconnect with you. You don't have to have the incumbent in most countries. It may be tricky where you are because I know you have two strong companies. I know for a while they were trying to make sure that those companies were interconnecting. Getting a CDN to work with you can be hard, but there are some brave content delivery networks. Usually we would see Facebook, Google, Akamai, and Cloudflare in that order. But Cloudflare is doing more and more work with local IXPs. And if you don't have contacts, and I'm not just promoting them over the others, but they are willing to work with local community networks, by the way, and IXPs if you have IP addresses. And I can put you in touch with them to help with deployment and interconnection. A lot of different community content delivery networks have different models, but I think if they know you've got good technical expertise, you've got an open platform, you can work out a way to work with them. It's the backhaul issues, or transit in this case, sorry, with the IX, that may be, from a financial perspective, something you're going to have to negotiate on. But you may want to see if you can get some free transit in the beginning to help you. The key thing about the governance model of the IXP is that there's a lot of communication. It's an open communication. You've got to be as neutral as possible in order to have credibility. That's been my experience. That neutral platform and neutral way of working, publishing your different rules of the road, if you have service level agreements, SLAs, or just how you operate, just that the community is very aware and feels empowered. Usually it's, from my experience, every entity that interconnects at the IXP is equal. It doesn't matter how much traffic you carry, or if you're a bigger carrier versus a smaller carrier, or a smaller ISP versus a bigger ISP, you're treated the same. That's really important. If you treat somebody that's a bigger network more important, as is more important than a smaller network, you're going to lose faith and trust by the community in general. And you're also setting up that weird telco dynamic that you want to try and stop. The internet community, you're looking at network to network interconnection. You're not looking at big telco to small ISP interconnection. It's important that that the government's working with you, not in a top-down way, but in a bottom-up way. They could be part of your governance structure as an observer. It's important to have oversight in meetings. It's important to make sure that, again, you're publishing all of your information about who connects. It shouldn't be a secret. Autonomous system numbers are not secret. It's very clear as to what organization they're assigned to, and you're connecting through ASN to ASN through Border Gateway Protocol. So if you don't have that training, yes, you can get the training. There's some free online training at the Internet Society. They'll also set up some free training with you, human to human, and to talk to you about a reboot. It's not. Don't be ashamed if you're stuck, because many IXPs have gotten stuck at one level, and you have to figure out how to level up. Is it a question of how you're charging? Are you charging for cross connects and ports to sustain you? Do you need to bring in that model versus grants? Do you need to have participation at a PHNOG or a SANOG meeting where you're learning more from other IXs? Maybe Apricot, you go and work with APIX, or you learn from some of the other IXs around the world. I know the Internet Society team can definitely introduce you to some of those IXs if you're just trying to look at the next step. I know that was part of the case for the IXP BKNIX in Thailand, where they had a certain number of, they sort of paused at a certain number of operators that were interconnecting. You really have to go out and talk to them and make sure they're not afraid to interconnect. In some countries, the companies that don't want to interconnect and have a more neutral exchange, cheaper, better, faster, will go to the government and try and shut you down, or will go to the government and say, I don't want to have to interconnect. It's not a good idea to have the government force the interconnection, because then it becomes a bit more of a regulatory problem that you want to avoid. IXPs in and of themselves are basically, they show the existence of the importance of competition. Because if all networks were able to interconnect in a country and the big incumbents were let the little guys interconnect with them, you wouldn't have to have this challenge of forcing, not forcing, but having the neutral interconnection, because you would already interconnect neutrally. But IXPs are a way to force that change and to actually be more agile in a country. It's cheaper. You get local traffic exchange faster. Quality of service goes up, as many of you know. It's just really important. And I may have missed some of those questions, but I'm going to connect you with Naveed. His email is, I should just type it in the chat, at isoc.org. He is an amazing human being. Talk to Naveed. He can set up a workshop for you, and they're free, obviously. Internet Society does all of this free. They have good financing or funding. Any other questions, Isabel, that I may have missed?
Yeah, so there's an
I just noticed that they put sorry, say that again, Isabel. I interrupted you.
There's another question, but so Bert's responding to your reply. So he's in the chat box. He said, "Thanks for the tip and the answer. Transparency is key. I agree, both in technical and business aspect of IXP operations, up-to-date SLA, port, and X-Connect fees for interconnecting." So Bert is actually involved in a PH Open IX.
Good.
Yeah, so that's why he's very interested in the IX questions.
And it's normal for an IXP or a community network to reach a point where everyone's familiar with the network. There may not be as much growth, and you've got to push a little bit more. Just remember, it's really important to know that the Links network, the London Internet Exchange Point, Links started out with 5 networks, donated equipment in London in, I think, 1996. It's Philip Smith, who's in your region, who's so fabulous. He's part of the Network Startup Resource Center. And NSRC has some great resources online too, in addition to ISOC. So check out the NSRC training materials. But Philip will tell you that when they started the London Internet Exchange Point, they had no idea how big it would grow, but it took different phases of development. And now it has thousands of networks coming through London. It has many points of presence and backup sites. It's got it's housed in an important data center. So its growth changed over time. You do need to work, I think, probably in your region with PH OpenIX to figure out how to get the other content delivery networks to work with you. Some incumbent operators will often threaten the CDNs, and I think it's important that you find somebody at one of the CDNs who's brave enough to work with you and figure that one out.
They
do. Achi's there. There's Achi. Oh, good.
Yeah, very good collab with Naveed. And yeah, we will continue to follow through.
Yeah, so there's a courses may be helpful too. Whoops, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, there's a question in the Q&A. Someone said they're curious about why the embassy prefer VSATs and also about more information about digital colonialism.
Sure. Now, I may get myself into trouble here, but I don't work for anybody right now, so I can say this. This wouldn't have been a problem even if I were at the Internet Society. I would say this, and I would say this at Connect Humanity anyway. So here we go. VSATs are very small aperture terminals, and it's a very easy way you can pull down a signal and push out a signal. It's a way to avoid having to interconnect with the local network. And if you're an embassy or an international organization, you might be less monitored that way. They're also just really easy to set up. And so I don't know if any of you have heard of a group called Télécom Sans Frontières, Telecom Without Borders. It's modeled after the Doctors Without Borders. And what they'll often do is go in after a natural disaster and they set up, I'm pretty sure it's a lightweight form of a VSAT to help with connectivity in a disaster situation, whether it's an earthquake or a typhoon or a cyclone or other. Télécom Sans Frontières has been running around the world helping set up those small satellites. But the VSATs are very common. I remember when I was in Armenia that the local authorities there wanted to regulate and to do something a little complicated. And the international community pretty much said to them, look, this is a really great way for us to get information in and out. And it's important that we be able to have that ability. So that's why VSATs were so useful. A lot of companies will use them too for redundancy purposes. If the local network isn't as reliable, they'll use them as either their main network or their backup. But it's a distributed network inside the embassy, I'm sure. Embassies. And what was the other question?
I think more information about digital
colonialism. Yeah, I don't know if any of you know Randy Bush. He lives in Japan right now. He used to live in, I believe it was Seattle. He's a very well-known technologist out of the IETF. He's also a very well-known, he's a great person to work with. He helped Dr. Kanchana set up the network, the IXP in Bangkok, along with Philip. with NSRC. We donated equipment, but they really were on the ground doing a lot of the work. I want to give credit where credit's due. Digital colonialism could be people, could be different organizations coming in and capturing a community with technology and not letting the local people be more empowered to design networks or to run networks, or it could be formed. And I'm going to get some of this wrong because this is Jane's version, but you really want to be careful that you're not working with the local community, the country, about the type of technology that's coming in, what it can do, how it works, and so that they have an opportunity to understand what the technology could do. And colonialization too is lock-in with technology, I would think. If people don't understand exactly what that technology does, it could be people coming in to say, we know better than you do, and you should do this, this, and this on a technology versus working collaboratively with people on the ground. I tweeted yesterday, I think, avoid digital colonialization. There are some people that think they know better than people in a country, and that's part of that colonial mindset. And again, it would be really important not to bring in technology that would lock in countries or not allow countries to be more open and neutral. I'm speaking very carefully because I don't want to get crosswise on some things there, but encryption is a really good way to avoid colonialization, and some countries don't allow encryption. I think it's an important thing to allow for end-to-end open encryption, and that's something I knew that the Internet Society and other organizations are working on. I just saw that there's another country that's not permitting Tor, which I find interesting, or just trying to block it. It's just fascinating that digital colonialization can also be when a country is a very powerful country, comes in and builds a network and gives you a loan. And then when you default on your loan, they own your network. We've seen this happen recently in it's been more with ports and airports right now, but it can also be with networks. And what that does is if you default on the loan, or if you allow one country to come in to build a network for you, you're locking yourselves in with that country, and then they're sort of running your network and in charge of your content, which could also be a security issue. So watch out for that. It's got to be a public-private partnership. It's got to be a partnership. There are ways to do this with different donors, but if you lock in with one country and they come in, they're basically running your infrastructure, and there's a lot going on there, from all sorts of aspects, from societal to monetary to network management. Network management is important. Anyway, so that's an interesting one. Any other questions? That was probably a weird question.
Another one here. What, in your opinion, is an acceptable speed to satisfy need of connectivity per user when we are designing a community network?
So I would avoid setting speed caps or requirements because, well, obviously you want a speed that's going to allow you to get what you want to push through on your network. But I'm really not a fan of saying you need a gig or you need, 100 megs minimum. If you start to set standards like that, you may not be able to meet them, and you may regulate yourself out of existence. I really worry about technical requirements. I mean, obviously there are some technical requirements for just stability and homologation and things like that, but you've got to be really careful that you don't set yourself up for failure with some of these network speed caps or requirements. Recently, we saw something with respect to, and we've worked really closely with A4AI on the concept of meaningful connectivity. They're more out there than the Internet Society was, and I'm a big fan of talking about universal connectivity, and whatever meaningful connectivity is up to the community to decide. But there is a lot of good policy work being done by Sylvia Cadena from the APNIC Foundation and Sonia Georges through something called the Policy Network, the PNMA of the IGF, where we're talking about meaningful connectivity. We're backing off a little bit, I think, in some places of dictating or saying that there should be a certain type of network speed or that it should be 4G. I know that A4AI has been really great at trying to move along the concept of meaningful connectivity because and what should be required in it. But I'm not a big fan of putting technological and capacity caps there because you are locking yourself into a potential regulatory policy problem. But it does help if you are working with, you're trying to start up your infrastructure in your country and get a better understanding of what capacities are that should be required. But again, it's up to the local environment, but big companies will box you out if you try and say you're only going to have a network that is X speed. So be careful with that. I'm being careful, maybe a little circular in my answer, because I'm a big fan of trying to figure out what's going to work and building your network up. Because if you try and aspire to something that you can't sustain from the get-go, that may not work. Now, if you're going to be a major player in a country bigger than some of the smaller community networks, and you want to carry a lot of video traffic, you're going to have capacity in the network, because if you don't carry it at a certain speed, the quality won't come through. So you're going to have that technical conversation on the ground, but be careful of lock-in of any kind of technology through a regulatory or policymaking process. But connectivity should be meaningful to the communities, and they should define that at that local level, I believe, or country level. But it should be an open conversation. It definitely shouldn't just be private sector and government. It should be civil society, technical community, and all actors being involved in that conversation. It can be hard to start that, but the chapter can be very helpful there in Manila and around the planet. The different chapters have been really helpful. I'm out of practice on the whole conversation there. Any other questions?
Yeah, so we have another one, again from Bert Mendoza. So he said, we're setting up a community network just outside of Metro Manila in the Philippines. I think I know where this is. This is, I think it's like 20 to 30 kilometers from Quezon City. How long do you think, based on your experience, what is the average time it takes for a community network to take off? What are some of the unique characteristics you observe from communities that have successful community networks?
So the length of time it takes a community network taking off depends on a lot of the local factors, right? How easy it is to get equipment in, how easy it is to if you have locally trained people, if the rules and regs and policy environment is amenable to you doing what you want to do. So it depends really. In Waimanalo, in that island community, it took off. The training was maybe 6 to 9 months, but it was intermittent training and lots of conversations during the Indigenous Connectivity Summit. But it took off at the summit, literally built and ran, and now it's running, and they're influencing other communities. So it can take 6 months, it could take a year, it could take 2 years, depending on all of your different local factors. So maybe this is another good thing that I can talk to the Internet Society staff to get out there, or APC, is a list of some of the local requirements. I'm pretty sure they have them in some of the case studies. You could pull them out, which would be whether you've got backhaul, great backhaul to the broader internet. Do you have unlicensed spectrum capability use in your country? Do you have the availability of equipment, easy to get in, easy to buy on the local market, super available? Your routers, your servers, your receivers and transceivers, do you know how to set them up? How long is that training going to take? Is the community ready? Do you know what happens if a mast falls down, and can you get it back up quickly? We had that happen in one community recently. So sort of the contingency planning running through from your strategic to your tactical levels. There's a lot of great, like Stephen on this call actually would be a good person to also talk to, who's in Ghana, because he's running a network. And there may be some things that he would know that I don't know. Obviously, he knows a lot I don't know, but there are certain things that he would know about setting up a network. And the New York City Mesh, asking get on the Slack channel with them. But that's also in an urban environment. So if you're going to be right outside Manila, you're going to need to be looking at some of what the existing rules of the road are with the government, because you do have a pretty good ministry and regulator. And so that's obviously talking to Benny and Ashi and some of the others about who they know and who you could talk to about, is there going to be any problem? I'm pretty sure you have unlicensed use of spectrum there, and it's not locked in just to operator spectrum only. And really, it's your local community and making sure everybody understands. You will be surprised by the number of people in some urban and rural, but urban areas for sure, who are afraid of technology and think the networks might harm them from a medical perspective. So from a health perspective, you're going to want to make sure you're really connected with some of the local governance folks in your community and that you've got their support. And I would say make sure you're bringing the youth along as well in the area, because this is a really great way having youth involved. There's a network in Baltimore that Dustin Loop, who's with the DC chapter of the Internet Society, helped set up. And these are kids who wanted to, they were in the inner city, and some of them are from low income families, and they were keen to have something to do after school, but also to empower their local communities after school, so that kids were studying versus being out on the street. So the kids were learning how to set up a network versus being on the street, but also helping their community get better through opportunity. Jobs, I don't know about in the Philippines right now or in Ghana or where others on the call might be from, but you've got to apply online for a lot of jobs, or you have to apply online to get your benefits from some government authorities. Where can people go who are low income to get that? So maybe your community network is also sort of a community hub, what we call an anchor institution. And in the US, they put some rules through in the regulatory, this was policy, that it was library, schools, and hospitals, but you can create your own community access center through a community network team. It could be a youth center, or it could be a library. Libraries are amazing. Librarians, putting in a pitch for librarians, because I've worked with them. Libraries are a natural place to host some of the equipment as well, because they're all about learning and education, and they're a safe space for kids and for seniors as well. And so think of your community network as a way to revitalize a community. It's really exciting because you want that community to support, own, and help sustain the community network. So that might be a way to look at it. But again, timing, it really just depends on how excited your community is, what you have as far as your technical expertise and wherewithal. And if you need radio frequency training, let us know. There's some folks at ICTP that would probably be more than happy to get on a call with you. If it were normal times, we'd send a team out. The Internet Society would send a team out to work with you, or APC, but there's a lot of good online training going on right now. There you go. And Stephen's just indicating that it depends on your community. And do try and see if you can get some of the local governance. I don't know what you call them. We've got mayors and local town authorities here. My mother, who's 80, is very excited about broadband now because she's fired up about all the funding that's going into the system here, which could be good, bad in the United States. But when people start to realize that there's a bottleneck for opportunity if you don't have connectivity. And so I really think that I can't imagine a country that wouldn't want to bring in multiple network options. It also is really good for redundancy and resiliency. I saw a network in the Eastern Cape of South Africa stand up after a bigger network from a bigger mobile operator had fallen. One of the masts had fallen down in a big windstorm, but because the community networks, transceivers and receivers were at a lower level to the earth, and they had a smaller tower, their network was still up and running. Now, okay, it may not always be the case that that's going to happen, but think of a community network too, when you're working with officials in a place, as providing more redundancy and resiliency, particularly in a time of an emergency, but also it creates more, it creates a better mesh in your community, connectivity mesh, but also a personal a human mesh. I often will say the human nets build the nets. It's all about the people. You really have to have that buy-in and trust at the local level. And UNICEF and the ITU are doing a lot more now. If you need connections to Giga, Alex Wong at the ITU is another great resource. Alex has done a lot of work with the World Economic Forum. He's a great person to chat with. They could talk to you about financing and about how Giga is coming in. Giga is mostly for schools, But I love the idea of a community center that would help bring in connectivity, but also revitalize a community. Community networks have done that. And you've seen all sorts of people, from mothers and with their kids out in certain parts of rural Africa and Latin America, coming together to build a networks with. So it's a network for everyone. So, and I know we're coming up on time, and I don't want to keep you all. I have more time if you'd like, but I am cognizant of the timing.
Yeah, and we have no more questions in the Q&A. Maybe another last call for any other questions that people may have. It was a very insightful session today. There's another question. Robert has followed up. You mentioned successful stories about CNs. Do you have any negative ones where a community network did not thrive?
That's a really good question. I know where there are certain circumstances where the network was stalled, but then it's picked up, and that was due to funding and equipment. There were some in some remote parts of, I think, Canada and the United States that may have not thrived, but it was probably due to the fact, I think from what I understand from some of these were not Indigenous networks, but I think it was mostly due to the lack of community support and funding. So your financing model, which was the question earlier, and the community buy-in and trust probably led to the lack of the deployment of that, or the continuance of that network. Most of the networks that I know, from Freifunk to Guifi to San Antipolo in Greece, to New York City Mesh, to Zanzaleni, to STEP, to others, Rhizomatica, it's such an important thing for the community when they realize that they can build this. It's such a point of pride together that they've done something collaborative that worked. It's not an empty promise, right? That they were able to self-determine how this thing grew and changed. That I don't know of failures, but it's a good question because you learn from failure. So let me ask some of the other colleagues about those that they know. It's usually when someone tries to take over too and isn't working in a community-based way that some things won't fail. Some things will fail. The same with IXPs. There's a question here from Gwyn about stand on the request of the telco. This is a really good question. And I think part of this is tied, Gwyn, to an attempt to do some regulation at a meta level, not Meta, the company, but at a higher level. Maybe the regulatory system there isn't catching up with the technology, which is always hard to do. The telecom operators in Europe requesting for content and platform development. Oh, this is the over-the-top services. Sorry, Gwen. This is boy, is this a longstanding issue. It's where some of the operators in some countries may not actually have developed CDNs themselves, and with the content delivery networks running traffic over their networks, they want a fee or a tax. Well, part of the deal is that those networks actually benefit from having more eyeballs and more content running over those networks. There is obviously a discussion about over-the-top services and subsidization, where some of the telecom operators want more money out of the content delivery networks. I believe that has been resolved through the OECD tax, 15% tax agreement. That's a global agreement. But what I do know was going on for some of those operators is they were not prepared. They were not prepared for the success of content and video in particular, even 10 years ago, 15 years ago now. There was a World Conference on International Telecom, WICIT, in 2012. Gosh, that was a long time ago. So now it's like 9 years ago, where this issue was coming up more and more because some of the companies hadn't built out their networks more and didn't have enough funding and subsidization to upgrade their networks. And so they were in a position where they had to ask for more subsidies from the European Commission or try and get them through an international treaty. They didn't get that deal worked out at the international treaty level because a lot of companies were like, no, this is not the way to go. But that, I think, Gwyn, is mostly due to carrying the traffic also could be something where they need to keep continuously upgrading their networks and they want a subsidy because that's what they're accustomed to. I would say that they've got to figure out a way to lower their costs to bring in more customers so that they can continue to manage that network, and not be looking for subsidies from just always from the content delivery networks, because those content delivery networks bring in a lot of value. And having them peer at an IXP has great value, and that's something that I know was asked earlier by Bert. So there's a way to do that to work with the CDNs. But that's a great question, Gwyn. Another observation I would give for you, and this is not my observation, but I asked the question. There's been a lot of regulatory proposals coming out of the European Commission with respect to DNS, platform security. This is something we also saw when I was in the government in 1997, 98, where Europe and the US probably need to have a stronger conversation about just working more collaboratively together. I think there were some collaborative challenges in the last 4 or 5 years in discussions about technology, rollout of connectivity, regulatory platforms, and whether or not to regulate. And so I think Europe is basically saying to the United States, hey, we want to talk, pay attention, because there was something recently, there's a DSA piece of legislation. There was something recently called NIS2, which the Internet Society did a great, the Internet Way of Networking team, and Joe Hall, who's a senior vice president for the Strong projects at ISOC, put a great synopsis out. You can check it out on the ISOC website. And others, but a diplomat told me that generally when you have this type of activity going on, they're asking for some collaboration and for people to pay attention. Years ago in 1997, 98, when Europe and the US were having a regulatory, standoff, it was when the DNS and ICANN were being created, the ICANN system was being created. Obviously the DNS existed. There was something called the Bangaman proposal, and then the Framework for Global Electronic Commerce was the US's sort of proposal or response to that proposal, which led to the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, which led to more dialogues around the world. I would say that people are just really looking for more collaboration among governments. And also, I would say we've got to make sure more stakeholders are involved so that it's not just governments making decisions, particularly from a security perspective on technology. And the last question we can take from Gwyn is how will it be possible? How can you make a difference? Well, you can definitely, I think, through the chapter, through your work with Achi, Bani, and others. Often the most useful way to create change is for dialogue. And I know it can be really hard. The first dialogue I tried to create in Moldova led to almost a bit of a problem with the regulator and the companies at that time. This was a long time ago. I thought, gosh, we can walk in and have an open dialogue, but it took some time, and then they did have an open dialogue, and it led to never be afraid to talk to hopefully you can do this with your government officials or some of the staff in the different ministries, to create an open dialogue about technology, about inclusion, digital equity, about the importance of connectivity for social economic growth, because many of them are politicians. They want to stay in power, but they really should open up that debate because they can learn a lot from you. And so you can influence it in ways you probably hadn't thought were doable. You could do it through having through the Internet Society chapter there, or through others that you know, with Isabel. Just having open dialogue, because online right now you can attract a lot of people because people are trying to avoid being in too close contact if they're not inoculated during COVID. But you can get a lot of people online to work with you to understand more about ways you can influence people at the local level, or just talk about the importance of the technical community or civil society in decision making. You may be able to suggest that you set up an open dialogue once a month. I know a country where they started to do that, and that led to the development of internet exchange points. It's led to better community network development. And it really is important to promote the idea with your government officials for open proceedings where you can contribute publicly available comments and reply comments. And that was something I know at the Internet Society that we're very keen to contribute to. And recently, the government of Kenya put a new licensing rule out, regulation that APC, ISOC, and others worked on the ground. APC with the FCDO out of the UK did a lot of work. And so, but it was a multi-stakeholder approach. And I think it led to a more robust and informed way of creating policy and regulation. So don't be afraid. There are a lot of good examples out there. And make sure the regulator, the ministry, and I'm pretty sure they do, post all the reply comments so that everybody can see what everybody said. That's really important. And be prepared to have to increase your capacity if you're at the regulator on your network that day, because reply comments can take down your website, as the FCC and NTIA both found out in this country. Didn't take down the websites, but was close. They got more comments than they thought they would. Anyway, that's what I would suggest is, use all of the good tools you have with the different local community actors. And I think in APC, you also have some community actors who you could work with there on the ground as well. And A4AI. You'll start to attract people when you start to put your voice out there, and don't be afraid to get it out on blogs and other platforms. So thank you, Isabel. I think, is that it?
I think that's it. And yes, it's going to be 8 p.m. here in Manila.
Oh, sorry.
It was a very inspiring talk. We all were so engrossed in your answers and all of your insights from your many years of experience in doing all of these things. I'm sure the others might have questions later on. I can link them up with you if they have other questions.
Absolutely.
Follow,
yeah.
So at this point, I would like to present to you a virtual certificate.
Yay! I love it. I'll cut it out.
Of appreciation for being here, for being our first speaker today, given on the 9th December, from the committee of the Women in Networking series. Thank you so much for giving us your time and sharing us your wealth of experience in this topic, community networks, ISPs, growing the internet. It was a very, very inspiring talk for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone here, and it was a pleasure to be here.
That's it. Platform, thank you, everyone. Yes, it's evening already. If you would like certificates of attendance, I think some need those. Yes, please fill up the feedback form that I linked in the chat. So thank you again, Jane. It was
Thank you very much. It was fun to be here. Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you to all the sponsors.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Yeah. Bye-bye.